Welcome back to session 2 for the Blue Forest Week 2021. The name of this session is Kelp from A to Z, pre-launch of the UNEP and Norwegian Blue Forest Network Global Kelp Assessment. And for the viewers that are new for this session, I would like to say that what you see here is sugar kelp, and what you see here is tangle kelp. The moderator for this session is going to join us from Nairobi in Kenya, and her name is Linda Jonsson. She's an associate expert for GEF International Waters as well as UNEP, and she's currently involved in several projects in the marine and coastal unit at UNEP. Now, she has a Master of Science in Rural Development and Natural Resource Management from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. So Linda, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for having us today. Yes, like Solon just said, I will be moderating this session today, and we have 4 other panelists with us who will be introduced briefly after a few videos that we'll be watching. So I think without further ado, we can actually start right away by viewing the first video, which is called Placing Kelp Forests in the International Climate Change and Biodiversity Discussion, and it's provided by the UN Environment Program here in Nairobi.
Thank you for inviting the United Nations Environment Program to today's discussion. My name is Takehiro Nakamura. I'm Chief of the Marine and Coastal Unit. United Nations Environment Program started the Blue Carbon Initiative with its first report, Blue Carbon, the Role of Healthy Oceans in Binding Carbon, in 2009. At that time, we didn't have sufficient data and information on whether kelp forests should be classified as blue carbon ecosystems or blue forests. Recently, more information becomes available to place kelp forest in the context of climate change mitigation and adaptation. In IPCC special report on oceans and the cryosphere, for the sensitive ecosystems such as seagrass meadows and kelp forests, high risks are projected if global warming exceeds 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial temperature, combined with other climate-related hazards. Kelp forests are one of the most vulnerable marine ecosystems to climate change. Researchers on macroalgae, including but not limited to kelp, estimate macroalgae could sequester about 173 teragram carbon per year, but 90% of this sequestration occurs through export of biomass to the deep sea, with 10% occurring through burial in coastal sediments. But how many countries already included such carbon in their nationally determined contributions? We have started seeing more evidence that the kelp has been shown to reduce acidity in surface waters. If so, can kelp forests be refugia for ocean acidification? We have also started observing that the kelp is an important ecosystem for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Kelp is closely linked with food security, nutrition, livelihood, and societal benefit sharing. Kelp ecosystems provide a wide range of ecosystem services, including food provision, eutrophication mitigation, as well as climate change mitigation. They play a key role in addressing biodiversity challenges discussed under the Convention on Biological Diversity. At the same time, seafood industry is the fast-growing food industry of the world. Seaweed accounts for 51.3% of global mariculture production and has been growing at the rate of 6.2% per year. That such industrial development pose threats to conservation and then sustainable use of ecosystem services offered by these vulnerable ecosystems. It is hoped that the forthcoming report on kelp ecosystems can provide sufficient scientific information so that all of us in the blue carbon and the blue forest community can actively place kelp ecosystems appropriately in the UNFCCC and CBD discussion. The report will our call for action in relation to climate change and biodiversity. Thank you very much.
Yes, so many thanks, Takehiro Nakamura, for providing that good overview. We have another video which was provided by the Norwegian Blue Forest Network that is called Kelp as a Nature Positive Solution, a Scandinavian Perspective.
Hello, my name is Peter Harris. I'm the Managing Director of GRID-Arendal. We are a Norwegian foundation, and we are proud to be a founding partner of the Norwegian Blue Forests Network. Along with our network partners and the United Nations Environment Program, we are developing a global assessment of kelp, which you will hear more about in today's session. Blue forests are coastal vegetated habitats such as seagrass meadows, salt marsh, rockweed beds, and kelp forests that are important natural sinks for carbon and that play an important role in climate regulation. Blue forests support a wide range of ecosystem services, including fisheries production, nutrient cycling, and human consumption. Kelp forests are an important type of blue forest ecosystem, especially for Nordic countries. But sadly, kelp forest ecosystems and their associated ecosystem services are declining around the world. In Norway, they are at high risk from climate change and other human impacts, such as eutrophication and coastal development. The decline of kelp forests in Norway was first reported by fishermen in the 1970s. The loss of sea urchin predators, likely a consequence of overfishing, was suggested to have caused a population explosion of the green sea urchin that overgrazed Norway's northern kelp forests. The large-scale degradation of kelp forests in the 1970s had profound implications for the health and productivity of Norway's coastal marine systems. The loss of kelp was accompanied by the loss of critical ecosystem services and economic benefits that these habitats provide. Sea urchins graze down an estimated 8,400 square kilometers of Norway's kelp forests, with a combined economic value estimated to be about 140 billion euros per year. Urchin barrens have persisted for decades, meaning that the loss of economic benefits continues. But this ecological catastrophe did not just impact coastal fisheries production. The loss of kelp forests also caused an estimated release of around 20 million tons of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere that was previously bound in living kelp biomass. This has affected the annual long-term deposition of carbon dioxide in deep-sea marine sediments over many decades. We hope that our work on the global kelp assessment will help to stimulate action to address the threats and stop the decline of kelp forests within Norway and around the world. One innovative potential kelp restoration action is a new approach. It's termed green gravel. Green gravel works by inoculating small pebbles of gravel with a spore culture, growing them to a young life stage in the laboratory, and then dispersing them into the environment. Dispersal can be done inexpensively by dropping the pebbles off the side of boats. Once on the seabed, the kelps develop and attach to the underlying bedrock. Ultimately, these kelps will spawn within the new habitat once they have reached reproductive maturity. We hope that the global kelp assessment will help encourage actions like the Green Gravel Initiative, and help safeguard kelp ecosystems for future generations. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the Norwegian Blue Forest Week.
Many thanks to Peter Harris for sharing that with us. And our last video is a behind-the-scenes look at the UNEP and NBFN Global Kelp Assessment Report. And this is everything about making the report.
Kelp forests are one of the most extensive coastal habitats on Earth. They are hotspots of biodiversity, and they play a key role in healthy and sustainable oceans. For the first time, a group of experts from around the world are coming together to create a global United Nations Environment Program and Norwegian Blue Forest Network report on kelp forests. The Kelp report is as diverse as its participants, which come from a range of countries, backgrounds, and expertise. They're working together to synthesize the best state of knowledge on kelp ecology, on the stressors and threats facing these ecosystems, on how they fit into international policy and law, and how we might best manage and restore them. One important component of the report is creation of a global distribution of kelp forests. And this is really an exercise in synthesizing all of the expert knowledge on where these habitats are found throughout the world to make the first global GIS map of the known distribution of kelp forests. The Global Kelp Report is a significant international initiative in the UN Decade on Ocean Science for Sustainable Development.
Great, so we will soon introduce our panelists who are here with us today. But before we start, I just wanted to give a little bit more of a background to the Kelp report. So like it was mentioned in the video, is that the UN Environment Program in collaboration with the Norwegian Blue Forest Network have convened a global network of kelp experts to develop a global synthesis document that will serve as a call to action to managers and policymakers and highlight the range of values that kelp forests provide to people around the world. This is also following the success launch of the Out of the Blue, the value of seagrass of the environment and to the people in June 2020. We're very excited to have started this development of the Global Kelp Report, and the goal of the report is to provide a scientific justification for policy outcomes and changes. And throughout the process, the report has engaged over 60 experts acting as authors and reviewers coming from 15 countries across all continents. And now I will introduce our panelists, and I will start with Alejandro Buschmann. He is currently working at the Research and Development Center for Coastal Resources and Environment at Universidad de Los Lagos. Alejandro does research in aquaculture, physiology, and ecology. And one of their current projects is towards the understanding of giant kelp, marine agronomy under stressful periods of cultivation. He is also the lead author of our Global Distribution and Drivers of Change chapter. Then we also have Karen Filbee-Dexter, and she is a marine ecologist studying the drivers and patterns of long-term change in coastal ecosystems at the Norwegian Institute of Marine Research and the University of Western Australia. She is the lead editor of the science section and a contributing author across several chapters of the project. Then we have Krumhansl, and she's a biologist with Fisheries and Oceans Canada at the Bedford Institute of Oceanography in Nova Scotia. Her research focuses on understanding the effects of climate change and other human stressors on kelp forests and other coastal ecosystems. She is the lead author of our Status, Trend, and Future Projections chapter. And lastly, we have Erika Techera, and she is an international and comparative law academic at the University of Western Australia Law School. And she is focusing on improving legal frameworks across the Indian Ocean to enhance marine environmental governance. She's the lead author of our policy chapter. So thank you so much, all of you, and welcome to this session. Before we start the panel discussion, I just wanted to kindly remind the audience to please submit comments and questions in the Q&A to all panelists and attendees in the drop-down box, as it automatically defaults to all panelists in Zoom. So just keep that in mind if you want to post any questions or comments. So if all panelists are ready, I think we can start with our questions to you. They're very comprehensive, but I'm very confident that you are well prepared to answer all of these since you are our very paramount experts. So the first one goes to Kira on kelp distribution. So Kira, can you explain to us where is kelp found?
All right, well, kelp has quite a wide global distribution. We know that kelp exists in almost half of the world's marine ecoregions. There's some areas where we know a lot about where kelp is found and other areas where we know a little bit less about those kelp dynamics, like in the Arctic regions. And so they occur from sort of the warm sort of edges of the temperate ecosystems all the way up to the Arctic, and their distributions are limited by temperature. They tend to like colder water, so they do well where it's colder. So at these sort of warmer edges where they exist, they are facing many threats and are under decline, which you'll hear a little bit more about later. But they also need high light, they need high nutrients, and they need rocky bottoms to grow on. So you'll find them on rocky shorelines.
Thank you so much for that, Kira. We'll continue and talk a little bit about the drivers and change. And the first one goes to Alejandro, which is what are the main threats that kelp forests face? Alejandro, you're muted.
Sorry, right now. Thank you for the invitation to be active in this panel. Well, as climate change, temperatures in the ocean surface increase, kelp species that are related to temperate, cold environments become stressed, and they even in some cases are starting to disappear from relevant parts of our coastal systems. So on the other hand, there are also other threats, also related to temperature, but other organisms like grazers, encrusting organisms, pathogens can also increase in the environment. And as the seaweed are stressed, they will not respond, and they can, in this way, be indirectly affected by temperature increases. So we are starting to understand all these threats that kelp forests face in the present, in the near future.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. We'll continue on the same track, and it's back to Kira again. So globally, is kelp growing or in decline?
Well, a number of years ago, it started to come to light from really detailed long-term regional studies that there were many regions for which kelp has been in decline for a number of reasons, like what Alejandro discussed. And so, a little while ago now, we got together and we put together all the existing data on kelp forest abundances through time that we could around the world. And we were able to provide some good documentation throughout the temperate range of kelps and less coverage in the Arctic range of kelps. But in that assessment, we found that there was an overall decline of kelp forests globally. And this was quite variable by region. Some regions, there were really long-term significant declines. In other regions, we didn't see so much change. And in some cases, kelp forests were increasing. One of the things to know about kelp forests is they do change a lot on short time scales. They respond to seasonal changes and interannual changes in conditions like temperature and nutrients and things like that. So in order to really determine what's going on with kelp, you need to measure kelp over a long time scale. And unfortunately, there aren't that many places. It's getting better and better through time, but where we have that much data. And interestingly, when we looked at the regions where we have the longest time series, we did find that that's where we were seeing these really long-term declines that are quite significant for coastal ecosystems. So kind of the general trends we see, as I alluded to earlier, so in this sort of equatorward ranges, edges of kelp, where they're distributed sort of at the warmer edges, we see these dramatic losses, in some cases related to gradual warming on top of other stressors like heat waves and pollution and other sorts of things. And then it's thought that potentially kelps in the Arctic will expand because at their northern range edges, they're limited by light, which can be restricted by ice cover. So as ice cover reduces, we may actually see some more productivity and expansion in the Arctic. But so far, we haven't seen a lot of evidence of that. So that's sort of yet to be determined. So overall, we are seeing and sense that global assessment that we did a number of years back. There's been even more regional evidence and longer time series showing these long-term persistent declines. So overall, there is really quite a concern for kelp forests globally and their trajectory.
Thank you so much, Kira. Yeah, it really sounds like some more efforts could be put into that exact topic for sure. So back to you, Alejandro, and we're gonna move into kelp farming. So could you give an easy description of what is kelp farming?
Well, large kelp, or large brown algae, what is called kelps, requires to be grown on controlled environments during the initial stages. These are microscopic stages that cannot be cultivated outside by its own. You need to do it under controlled conditions. And after 1 month, 40 days, you can get seedlings, few millimeters, seedlings that are attached to ropes, and you can deploy it into the ocean and on suspended systems that maintain them near the surface so that they have light availability and they can grow fast. The harvested biomass of kelp is mainly used for food or polysaccharides, feeds, ingredients, pharmaceutical and cosmetical use. So there is a demand for this. And so the harvested biomass can be useful. And finally, I'm willing to stress out that right now, most of the kelp produced is through farming. We produce over 30 million tons of farmed seaweed and only 1 million tons due to wild harvesting annually. And but the farming is mostly done 99% in Asia. In America, Europe, we still are harvesting our wild populations. And that is another threat that in some places, like in my country, in Chile, it is a complicated matter how to regulate these harvesting, natural harvesting populations. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Alejandro. We will continue on to Karen for the next question. So Karen, could you please explain to us what are the other uses of kelp?
Sure, and thanks for inviting me to be on this panel. Yeah, so oral histories and archaeological evidence have actually shown that the relationship between humans and kelp forests has been going on for millennia, with humans using kelp for food, but also for medicine and for other materials. But currently, today, we're using kelp also for food, but also for alginate, for animal and aquaculture feed, for the pharmaceutical industry, and then for medicine and textile industry. And as Alejandro mentioned, there's still a number of countries that are commercially harvesting wild kelp populations, and 48% of this harvest is from Chile, and the other 22% is from Norway in terms of biomass.
Great, thank you so much. And then we are going back to you, Alejandro. So what are the main constraints of kelp farming?
Well, I think besides the use of kelp as food in Asia, in which the society is willing to pay a higher value for the resource, in Occidental countries, most of the demand is related to the polysaccharide industry, which pays a much lower value for the biomass. So there is a commercial value that do not incentivize or is not the driver for growing the industry, and we still rely on smaller markets that are growing, and the interest is growing, but still not with a large demand, market demand. Therefore, from my perspective, farming is in Occidental countries economically limited and not technologically limited, or less technologically limited, I will say. As we know how to culture, there is the experience in Asia, the technology is known for several species. So I think that is the major constraints that we face in Occidental countries right now.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty tough constraint, and I hope we can overcome that one somehow. And yeah, so we're going to move on to talk a little bit about the kelp and their ecosystem services. And the first question goes to you, Karen, which is, does kelp help restore and sequester carbon in the ocean?
Sure. Thanks. So kelps and other seaweed forests are actually the largest and the most productive underwater vegetated habitats in the world. So they grow really quickly, and they're actually capturing a lot of CO2 from the water and converting that into living plant tissue. And then a portion of that living plant material gets exported away from the high energy, shallow areas where kelp forests grow, and it moves into adjacent regions where it can be buried in sediments on the seafloor, or it can even reach deep ocean waters, where if it reaches these areas, it actually can enter really long-term carbon cycles and be sequestered for over centuries, which represents a natural carbon sink. So there's a lot of recent technologies and new innovation that are actually tracking the flow of this material, and also using things like DNA techniques to trace kelp in deep ocean bodies and in deep sediments. So we're seeing more and more that kelp carbon is reaching these sinks, but there's a lot of large uncertainties about the fluxes of this kelp to these ocean sinks. So right now, kelp is not recognized as a blue carbon habitat because of these large uncertainties in the fluxes, but very coarse estimates of what kelps could potentially be sequestering every year are substantial and equivalent to many other blue carbon habitats, but we just need to narrow the errors scientifically before we can actually fully understand their role.
Thank you so much, Karen. And yes, again, back to you, Alejandro. And so what are the unknowns about the potential use of kelp farming for carbon sequestration?
Well, scientists are just starting to understand the role of farmed algae in the environment. It has been proven that seaweed can extract nitrogen from the water, reducing coastal eutrophication. However, carbon pathways are much more complex in the ocean than in terrestrial environment. And the understanding that we have right now is that if we harvest the biomass we will have to transport the biomass that has 90% is water, so it's energetically costly. And we need to process the biomass, producing again CO2. On the other hand, seaweeds are not trees, and they will not meet the criteria of sequestering carbon for hundreds of years in the biomass. They're recycling. There is a turnover of CO2. Furthermore, seaweeds produce large quantities of dissolved and particulated organic matter. And how this organic matter move with currents are complex, as they may not always end up in the deep ocean. We need to establish how there are the fluxes and from what environmental factors that depends. Also, seaweed kelps are not equal. We have some that are, they can float, they have a positive buoyancy, others that they have a negative buoyancy. So the patterns can be different. And finally, I think we need to understand what storms or bad weather can affect seaweed farming by detaching biomass, large amounts of biomass, and where this biomass will land. Actually, we know, for example, with El Niño, that large amount of seaweeds lands on the beaches, and that will be degraded and transformed again into CO2. So all these complexities require scientific attention, and the good point is that many scientists around the world are concerned and taking actions on these questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Alejandro. And the last question about the ecosystem services goes to you again, Karen, which is what is the value of kelp forests?
So that's a really broad question, because kelp forests are providing a lot of different benefits and what we could call values for humans. But just to start off, they're biodiversity hotspots, which we heard about earlier. And this is because they're actually they're foundation species that are creating underwater habitats. So the kelp fronds are actually shading the seafloor. They're creating three-dimensional structure that increases the amount of space for animals to live and to shelter in. They also they're plants, so they're providing a lot of primary production and food for many coastal fish, for shellfish, for a number of different animals. It was measured that up to 80,000 individual organisms can live on a single individual kelp, and up to 70 species can be on one kelp in Norway, which is really extraordinary. But some of these species that live in kelp forests are commercial species. So in this way, kelp forests are important for supporting healthy coastal fisheries. And this, of course, depends on where you are in terms of what fisheries this could be. But for example, in South Africa, kelp forests are linked to healthy abalone, lobster, and octopus. In Australia, to crayfish and various fish species. In the North Atlantic, to cod and other groundfish that use the kelp as a nursery habitat, and to wolffish and sea urchins. And then Chile to rockfish and reef fish, urchins and abalone in Korea and Japan, and sort of the list goes on. But beyond these sort of true valuation studies, kelp forests are also really important culturally in a lot of places. They are shown to support the identities of many indigenous, many coastal people that live around the world and live beside these habitats. And this can range from the Inuit in the Arctic to First Nations in the Pacific Northwest, to Maori in New Zealand, and a lot of other coastal people that live and have a presence and either work or use the kelp forest ecosystem. So to date, there's only 4 economic valuation studies actually demonstrating how valuable all these services are. And I've only mentioned a few. But there's a general consensus that the total economic value of kelp forests today is underestimated, and that a lot of work needs to be done to really refine these numbers and get a handle on how important these ecosystems really are.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting for sure. We're going to move to kelp and policy, both on international and national level. So Erika, I'm going to hand over 2 questions to you, but I'll start with one, which is, how could kelp be sustainably managed?
Thank you, Linda. So I think if we think about what we've just been told about the science, the threats, the loss and degradation of kelp habitats, and the values and ecosystem services they provide, we need to embed all that science in a framework that allows us to sustainably manage kelp forests. And we can do that through policy. At the national or international level, we can set policy goals, targets, action plans to address threats, manage activities like kelp farming or harvesting, and to recognise those ecosystem services. And then we can use economic tools or educational tools to achieve those policy goals. But we can also use legal policy levers, if you like, to provide those binding standards. And those standards can be quite important if we are trying to look at harmonising activities across different states. We can create regulatory frameworks for harvesting or farming with licensing regimes to ensure sustainable levels of activities. And obviously we can require monitoring and compliance and enforcement if those rules are not being adhered to. So I think in combination, I mean, the key issue I think is to embed the science that we know and that is continuing to emerge, and to use law and policy together to achieve sustainable management.
Great, thank you so much. So just continuing on this, is kelp recognized in national and international policy?
So in terms of international law and policy, we know there's a number of international treaties. We've heard about some of those already. But if we look at whether kelp is actually specifically mentioned in those treaties, it's not, but it's increasingly being recognized. And if we look at, for example, the World Heritage Convention, there are over a dozen sites in the world that specifically mention kelp, and many more where kelp features within those sites. Similarly, under the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, there's protection as well. We know that kelp are included in some of those wetlands. Almost 30 in the world are, again, explicitly recognized, and more kelp features within those. Obviously, there's other treaties as well. We've just heard a little bit about blue carbon. And as the science emerges on the blue carbon values of kelp, then it may be possible to utilize the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Paris Agreement, nationally determined contributions to better recognize and protect kelp as well. I think there are opportunities for the kelp to be managed and restored under different international law and policy. And if we look at sort of the softer policy end in that global sphere, then obviously the Sustainable Development Goals become really important. Kelp can both contribute to achieving those goals, but can also benefit from some of the targets set as well. I think there's probably more examples around the world at the national level where we do see national legislation and policy in particular country contexts being used to manage activities where, for example, kelp farming and harvesting is important. There has been law and policy for quite a period of time in those countries. In other countries where fisheries are important and kelp are recognised as habitats for fisheries, or within marine reserves, there's different law and policy responses in those countries depending upon the national interests and the particular uses or values that are ascribed to kelp in those countries. But again, I think there's more opportunities here because there's increasingly transboundary opportunities. There's cooperative arrangements that can be put in place between countries, but also the sharing of knowledge of what works well. the more we know about the kelp forests themselves and their threats and the risks to them, the more we can explore opportunities and learn from other countries about how to strengthen our law and policy in different areas. And we know that there's continuous developments. There's a recent bill been tabled before Parliament in America, focusing on kelp, and in other countries, all the way down to the very local level, where we see customary law, Indigenous traditional laws being utilised as well to protect and manage kelp.
Thank you so much, Erika. That's very, very useful to know for sure. We are actually running out of time. So the last question, we will try to keep it very short, very to the point, but it's, again, it's a very big question, but we can start with you, Erika, and then we can go with Kira and then finish with Alejandro, which is what are the main takeaways going forward?
So I think we need to basically focus much more sharply on kelp forests as a particular type in terms of the species, but a particular type of ecosystem. Use law better than we have, use policy to greater effect than we have in the past, and to make sure that we're filling gaps and addressing science as it emerges, to constantly monitor and change and shift what we're doing so that we can make sure we're meeting the needs of the specific ecosystem, but also responding to the science.
And then I guess my takeaway to add would be, yeah, so kelp forests, they're covering 28% of the world's coastlines. They're these biodiversity hotspots. This is an area about 5 times larger than our coral reefs, and they're declining faster than our tropical rainforests. So, and they're consistently underrepresented in international treaties and frameworks and agreements, as Erika mentioned, and they should be essential components of our strategy to address biodiversity crisis, to address food insecurity and the climate crisis.
And I'll just add, you know, I'd like to emphasize also that these are just tremendously important ecosystems. They're beautiful, they're wonderful, they provide a lot of services, they're increasingly recognized as playing a really important role in global carbon cycling. And so I really wanted to just put another plug in for doing every effort that we can, putting every effort towards trying to protect these ecosystems because they are under threat, and there are ways that we can sort of mitigate these threats to allow kelp forests to flourish.
Okay, as we have been discussing, kelps provide several ecosystem services. These are multiple and ecologically relevant. In addition to that, there is these organisms are economically relevant. They provide several sources of products for humanity. And it is urgently necessary to include kelp conservation plans to develop and incentivize farming actions to reduce the extraction pressure, especially in countries like Chile and maybe Norway. So helping to maintain these resources and their ecosystem services for the next generations. And for that, we need, it's also a requirement right now for having the correct information and enough information, scientific information, for having the best management regulations that we can have.
Thank you so much, everyone. I can already see that Solrun is here with us. I just wanted to double check if it's okay that we bring up the 2 questions that have been answered, or are we out of time? Or asked, yeah, not answered.
You are technically out of time.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Linda, for guiding us through this deep dive on
Thank
kelp.
you so much for having us.
So this concludes the formal program for today. So I want to say thank you to all those who participated today. and thank you to those who have followed us online. And I hope you return tomorrow and on Thursday. Tomorrow's session is about what the value from Blue Forest. It's going to be in Norwegian, and it's going to be at 9:30. But Thursday's session is going to be partially in English, and it's going to talk about solutions. So I hope our international viewers will come back for that as well. Now, I'm joined now by Peter Haugan from the Institute of Marine Research. Peter is one of sort of my partners in crime on the board for this Norwegian Blue Forest Network. He's also a very qualified researcher. He's a program director at the Institute of Marine Research, professor of oceanography at the University of Bergen, and he works with a lot of different things related to oceanography and oceans, such as ocean carbon and climate, and also a lot with the science policy interface. So you're one of the chairs of the follow-up of the International Ocean Panel here in Norway. But Peter, you're going to take us through a blue discussion later, and you're going to talk about sort of your impressions from today, tomorrow morning. But can you give us a teaser? What's sort of your one takeaway message for today, from today?
Yeah, thank you, Solrun. Thank you, and thanks to all who have participated. I've been listening in carefully, and I really enjoyed this day. It was kind of a packed agenda with a lot of things from the ongoing discussions on climate, on biodiversity, and then finally this update on kelp, trying to bring kelp into these discussions in a better way in future than has been the case in the past. I think the way in which the climate side of things and the biodiversity kind of side of things begin to talk the same language, begin to talk to each other, and when we can sort of merge that with food and with coastal communities and various other needs, I think we are on a good track. So I'm really excited after this day, and I'm also very excited to be able to talk to you, to everybody who has listened, if you want to join me in the blue discussion, because we are going to talk about, you know, what well, first some impressions maybe from today. You will have the possibility to take the floor, but also thinking about reflections for the future. How do we deal with this issue in the future? So when we close here, there will be, you take 1 minute to stretch, and then we'll meet on Zoom again to be able to discuss where we are coming from and where we are going with this topic before the formal program continues tomorrow. So see you in a few minutes.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Peter. Yeah. And come back. And those who weren't able to ask questions in Linda's session, please join Peter and you can ask them there. So thank you so much, and good luck in the blue discussions, Peter.
Thank you, and see you all there.